Yeah. What's up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity, the #1 theological podcast on the interwebs. That's right. For over 11 years, we've been bringing you audiological ingredients, some of the best thinkers from the academy, right into your earbuds, so that no matter who you are, where you're from, what questions you have, what doubts you have, what excitement is going on in your brain piece, you get the best ingredients and ideas right there, so you can brew up something tasty, zesty. So, yeah, that's what we do. And today on the podcast is John Haught. That's right. John Haught, legendary religion and science theologian, scholar that's worked on the relationship of religion and science for a long time, and been a part of a lot of the public battles around embracing evolution as a people of faith. But our conversation today is starts off about his new book, which is amazing and gets about as robust of endorsement as I can give anything. It's called The New Cosmic Story. Oh yeah. New Cosmic Story, great book. It's about the inside story of big history. It's about how most science, right, is based on things you can observe, that's repeatable, that's testable, interactable. So like a rock, you can look at a rock, you can test a rock, you can look at the rock, see all the particles and all that kind of stuff. But, you don't know what it's like to be a rock or a bat. You don't know what it's like to be a bat. You don't know what it's really like to be any other person, but you can know how all the parts are and stuff. And so one of the questions he's wrestling with is, what is that inside story, that part of experience that we know of ourselves? What is it like? What's that inside part for the cosmos and its big story from the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago to today? And what's religion's role and place in it? What's morality's role in it? Like, can we say that's growing, developing and stuff? Oh, yeah. That's why I'm so excited to talk about this with him. He's also a fan of Teilhard and Alfred North Whitehead, so that's just like Christmas. Anyway, before we jump into this episode, I want to tell you a few things. 4 simple announcements. Announcement number 1. We now have updated and are launching a whole game-changing relationship with the members for Homebrewed Christianity. If you go to homebrewedcommunity.com, you can still join the community. But here's the difference. You say, Trip, it still looks like the same levels. Like I could be an acolyte, I could be a deacon, I could be an elder, I could be a bishop. Yes, you can purchase your ecclesiastical title and join the community, support the podcast. But we have a whole host of easier access to all the perks and new perks and all kinds of things. And here's why. I'm going for 1/2 of 1% of the listeners supporting the podcast. If 1/2 of 1% support the podcast, I'd actually know I was going to pay all my bills and like my student loans. I mean, because adjuncting doesn't technically pay student loans, but on top of that, I want to make sure we keep bringing zesty theological ingredients, interactions with all sorts of different scholars to the masses. Here's I'm an evangelist for getting nerdy. Right? And that's what I love doing. I'm excited about doing it. And I want to keep doing it. And so that's why I'm asking you. This doesn't happen very often, but to consider being a member of the Homebrewed community. Go to homebrewedcommunity.com. And here's the new things. This is what I was going to tell you. If you're a deacon, there's a new podcast we're launching this summer called the Deacon Beacon. In that podcast feed, which you get you get the link, you add it to your podcast, whatever app you're using right now to listen to this. And then you don't have to do any work. You get access to all of the open classes and stuff we do at Homebrewed. Like, in June, the John D. Caputo Theology of Culture class, or some of the previous classes and things will all be in that podcast feed. You'll be able to get access to those and special podcasts regularly that are just members only podcasts. That's awesome. And you won't have to do all the extra work. There was one of you that told me about this idea, a private podcast feed. And then you don't have to go through, we probably have like 30 classes I've done. And they're all sitting in a Dropbox folder for members to get and stuff. And then it gets complicated and you have to keep up with it. And occasionally people make them disappear and then have to re-upload them. But they'll all be in a podcast feed and I can keep adding new stuff. You know what I mean? delivering it right there. It's going to be the Deacon Beacon podcast. So you should be a deacon or an elder. And elders, here's what I'm doing. I'm going to be doing lectures. You'll be able to pick the topics, right? But also you'll be getting lectures from when I teach classes and stuff. So you'll get the lectures. I'm doing a class on Star Wars. I'll be doing some lectures on Star Wars and philosophy. You'll get some amazing lectures on process stuff. Because this summer, June 3rd to 7th, I'm going to be in Claremont for the Center for Process Studies summer class. I'm teaching a 1-week intensive. You're more than welcome to come. You can take it online or in person. But June 3rd to 7th, if you're an elder, the stuff I record, my lectures and things, I'll put them in there, which will be a preview of my next book. It's like 98% done. Boom. Process Christology right there. Right there. I'm going to do the lectures, get feedback and stuff from people. If you're an elder, you'll get them. Or if you just come take the class. And here's the best reason to think about coming. It's not me. It's that the other people teaching classes that week are Catherine Keller, Donna Bowman, and Everyday Lunch Q&A time with John Cobb. I know. And it's in Los Angeles, so it's fun. Anyway, you should think about coming. But, yeah, so the elders, on top of getting all the Deacon Beacon stuff, will also be getting access to the lectures. And this year, I've already outlined a series of lectures based on feedback from members. They're like, look, we want to get some of the basics, some of the big ideas, some of the framework so that we can better place guests that come on the podcast. And so here's what I'm doing. I'm doing a lecture series over the course of the year, introducing the major figures in schools of thought from the 20th century. Major things like Barth, Bultmann, Pannenberg, all that kind of stuff into different schools of thought, like, black theology, feminist theology, liberation theology, process theology, all that kind of stuff. And so I'll be adding them. The elders will get them. We'll interact with it. But the goal is, to provide the background information that a lot of the guests on the podcast, assume and may not always introduce, so that you can catch up. And the other side is like, I like teaching. Like I went and did my PhD because I want to teach theology, and here you are, and here I am. And if you want that and want to go to bed knowing you support the podcast at night, you can join. There you go. Look at that. All right. Anyway, that's over with. Now it's time for John Haught, one of my favorite episodes, and you just buckle your theological safety belt, okay? Because it's going to get zesty. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Tripp, and today on the podcast is the one and the only John Haught. He is a legend, religion science scholar, Catholic theologian, has published a whole bunch of books. And his newest book, The New Cosmic Story, Inside Our Awakening Universe, is a spectacular read. And for those of you that like listening to podcasts, there's an Audible version, so you can listen to someone read it to you. But we're on the podcast talking today, and I'm about as excited as I get, until the Pope comes on. So thanks for being here, John.
Thank you for having me, and don't put too much pressure on me.
Okay. Well, I'll only ask questions that the imaginary version of you in my head enjoyed answering. I have when I go to bed reading someone's book, and I've read a number of their books, sometimes I have weird dreams where I talk to them. And last night, you and I had a conversation.
Okay.
So maybe the place to begin is for you to share a bit about your own understanding and story around your own vocation. How did the intersection of theological reflection, religious studies, and science and the life of the church all connect?
Yeah. Well, for a number of years, I was studying to be a priest, but I dropped out after 2 years of theology. But before I dropped out, I had been exposed a little bit to the writings of the Jesuit geologist and paleontologist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, and I liked what I read so much. In fact, in a way, it changed my whole way of thinking. And this was right after the Second Vatican Council, which I learned later had been deeply influenced by the writings of Teilhard, even though earlier he had been condemned, or his writings had been censored, that is, by his own church. And I got captivated by his vision, and I decided after I left seminary that I wanted to go on in theology. And so starting at Catholic University, which is where I got my doctorate, I started reading more of Teilhard. And then I went across town and got a job at Georgetown University in Washington. And after I'd been there only a couple of years, I started developing a course on science and religion, which I taught almost every semester until I retired. And throughout all that period, the intellectual backbone of my course was shaped by, among others, Teilhard de Chardin, but also as I developed the course, the writings of Alfred North Whitehead had a great impact on me, as did the writings of the Jesuit epistemologist, the theoretician of knowledge, Bernard Lonergan, and his book Insight. And then also the writings of Michael Polyani, along with Protestant theologians like Jürgen Moltmann and Wolfhard Pannenberg. And out of this came, little by little, a sense that the context for discussing issues in science and religion has shifted over the last century, over the last 2 centuries in a way, so that now the issue is not so much that of the old natural theology, whether we can look in nature for exquisite engineering and organic design. The question is not so much whether design points to deity, but the question increasingly became for me whether the cosmic story, the 13.8 billion year cosmic story, which I was learning about, and the story of life, which is contained within that, whether the story, or as I call it, the drama, carries a meaning. And that is really, for me, the main question in science and religion.
And now, I think there's one sense that at a popular level, people assume the cosmic story carries some meaning, because the way popularizing science works is to have beautiful backdrops on public broadcast, and you tell this huge story, and it ends with a scientist probably crossing their fingers off camera going, "You are stardust awakening," or something like that, right? But there's also this public expression of science that's vehemently reductionist, anti-religious, but it's also resists acknowledging consciousness or something like that. So when you start to think of the resistance that you experience in kind of making your biggest picture and interlocuting with science, where are those tension points most prevalent?
Well, I think there are three main ways of reading this new story, and one of them, I call it the archaeonomic way. It's the way of trying to make sense of the present by digging back into the past. And the further you dig back into the past, the more the universe falls apart into eventually subatomic fragments. And that ideal of explanation is to start in the past and then try to fill in the process step by step that led up to the present. But there's a kind of metaphysical belief that goes along with that approach. I call it the metaphysics of the past. It's the view that if you want to understand the present, all you have to do is break down complex entities right now into their component parts, and that amounts to the same thing as going back to the remote past. And that's the ideal of explanation in this archaeonomic view. So in that view, there is no story at all. The universe is just a matter of reshuffling of subatomic elements over the course of time. In Duke University, there's a philosopher named Alex Rosenberg. That's his vision of things. Daniel Dennett's view of evolution, the story of life, is that it's just an algorithmic rearranging of fundamental elemental units over the course of time. And that's really all that's going on in what I call the archaeonomic, or you could call it the scientific materialist view of things. So it sees, and ironically, this way of looking at things has helped us uncover the story step by step, but it sees no meaning in the story. So that's one way of reading it. A second way is the old-fashioned way, I call it the analogical view, which goes back to Plato and much Christian theology since Augustine and others, which takes the Greek philosophical way of looking at the universe as a kind of dim reflection of an eternal perfection that exists elsewhere. And in that way of looking at the universe, the meaning of things is simply that they express in their own limited way the unlimited beauty and goodness of the eternal present that exists outside of time. So people in that tradition, I call it the analogical tradition, might be aware of the cosmic story notionally, and they might have read some science, but they don't see any meaning in the story either, that is, in the dramatic narrative progression from the past. The meaning of natural things is that each in its own way, as St. Thomas Aquinas said, expresses something of the perfection of God.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a beautiful worldview, and it has worked for many centuries. And I would submit that almost all contemporary Christians are still shaped mostly by this analogical vision of things. So what I've done is propose a third approach, and the genesis of this approach in my own thinking goes back especially to Teilhard, but it has been supplemented by many other scientists, philosophers, and theologians over the last 40, 50 years. I call it the anticipatory approach, and I think it's one that is quite consonant with what you might call the Abrahamic or biblical view. It's the view that if you want to understand the present, you have to open your eyes not just to the past, not to the eternal present, as the analogical and archaeonomic vision propose, but that you open your eyes, your attention, your whole being to what is coming from up ahead. And for me, the chief religious example of that was Jesus, who, when he came into his public ministry, did not start out by telling people how to behave. He told them something really big is coming.
Mm-hmm.
And in only after, he assumed that only after you've been grasped hold of by this coming, this future that's coming into the present, will you be able to undertake a proper, authentic life of faith.
Mm-hmm.
But in order to do that, you have to abandon the security of understanding things only on the basis of the past and open yourself to the fact that now in the contemporary cosmic context, the universe is still coming into being.
Mm-hmm.
And if the universe, as modern science has shown, is still coming into being, then we can't really understand it in the here and now. The analogical approach is inadequate, and the archaeonomic approach, which relies basically on what happened in the past, neither one of those are intellectually or spiritually helpful as far as understanding what our situation is right now. So epistemologically, the only realistic way to approach reality in the anticipatory perspective is by adopting the disposition of faith and hope, and then open yourself to the future. And of course, that's not easy.
Yeah.
Because if it's a long story, you have to wait, and you have to wait a long time. But that's the kind of perspective that I take with me when I look at the new cosmic story.
Mm-hmm. Well, and one of the ways you frame the conversation around really expanding the narrative of life on the planet to needing a narrative of the cosmos.
Yes,
is you pose the question of, in a way, I don't remember exactly how you do it, but we need to tell the cosmic story in a way humans and our conscious experience and awareness and awakening in the world makes sense. And when you think in an archaeonomic way or in that stream, then we seem to be an anomaly, and perhaps this space-time is an anomaly because there's a multiplicity of universes, and the reality of this narrative shape and growing complexity and depth of experience is something to be explained away as opposed to something to be wrestled with and such.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that's still the dominant intellectual and academic perspective, that therefore, if the universe is reducible to lifeless and mindless stuff, if that's the reality, that's your metaphysics, your sense of what is really real, then when you look at the phenomenon of life, and then later the emergence of consciousness, and then later on faith and religion, then all these later developments seem to be epiphenomenal. That is, they're not really real. They're just secondary, accidental spandrels, as Stephen Jay Gould would call them, that don't really have anything to teach us about the nature of reality. But they're anomalies that happen, and we should follow their path through history. But the fact that they emerge does not tell us anything about what is really real. The universe is fundamentally this mindless, endlessly meandering process. And in that context, in that pessimistic materialist way of understanding, when you look at the story of life, it too simply becomes a kind of pointless exercise of cosmic energy, but not really able to tell us anything about the nature of the universe. I think that's really kind of silly in a way, because what that leaves out, and this is one of the main points of the new cosmic story, is if we leave out the fact of our own minds, the fact of consciousness, which even materialists have to admit has been spawned and given birth to by this cosmic process. If you leave that out when you try to get to what is the universe all about, it seems like trying to understand a story without following it all the way to the end, as it were. Now, I'm not saying mind is the end of the process, but what I'm saying, and this is what Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was emphasizing, and I've taken this with me throughout my career, and that's that if you want a real, wide, empirically broad understanding of the universe, you simply can't leave out the emerald of evolution, the human mind, in your attempts to understand what the universe is about. So what I like to do is start with mind and try to investigate it. And here's where the philosopher Bernard Lonergan was so very helpful to me, because his book Insight was one of the most brilliant studies of what mind is, of what thought is, of what insight is, of what knowledge is that I've ever read. And to leave that out in your understanding of the universe as though that's purely accidental or incidental to the fundamental fabric of things, which is how science and intellectual life still approaches it, seems to me to be very unempirical. Lonergan taught me what he calls a generalized empirical method, and that's don't leave anything out of the data when you try to explore the universe. And one of the things that's closest and most palpably evident to all of us is the working of our own minds. And so look at what mind is after, and what mind turns out to be is a deeply anticipative organ or phenomenon. Mind is always anticipating understanding. And once it finds understanding, it wants to find truth. And also it wants to find why we should act the way we do, and so forth. So the mind is an anticipative phenomenon. Now, what science, astrophysics, has taught us, and evolutionary biology, is that this mind, that's very anticipative in its whole nature and being, is intricately interwoven to this whole cosmic process that goes back 13.8 billion years. So that, in a way, the gestation of life and mind is already taking place at the beginning. But we can't understand the beginning until we look at what has turned out so far. And since the process is still going on, we have to look for the possibility of other surprises still emerging in the future. We have a universe that's 13.8 billion years old, but for all we know, in the final analysis, that might turn out to have been just the very dawning of a process. I mean, I think we have to keep ourselves open to these possibilities. And cosmic pessimism cuts off such speculation at its very roots. And I think that's both intellectually incoherent and spiritually deadening at the same time. So that's the point I've been trying to get across.
No, I think that that tendency that you get in a reductive account to see the present and the analysis of things in the present alone, that pattern affects a lot of stuff. Like I remember sitting in a church history class where the professor says, "Yeah, but just imagine 2,000 years from now, we're ending early church history. What if by the end of the early church history, the church has recognized the beauty of difference in the way cultures have received the gospel and embodied it, and a power that different voices are able to shape? and give to it, and the value of the creation that's there. So often when everything has to be explained, so our present contains all the potential, you end up in a reductive account. And I think the ministry of Jesus and just good parenting is looking at whatever's before you and going, you have no idea the potential. Don't limit it. And so that to me was one of the really powerful way in the way you frame the book, is that kind of kingdom hermeneutics of seeing the present as the very place newness comes into being is being cultivated, and going like, that's also what you're doing when you're looking at science in the big picture. You're ready to have your worldview shook up again and have to reinterpret it.
Yes. And that's exactly the disposition that I'm trying to cultivate in my writings. And it's also one that allows us to think of God in a new way also, as the frontier, the realm of possibilities, or the source or reservoir of the possibilities that are always being presented to us each day, each moment of every day. And I correlate that with the notion of the future, which is a very Abrahamic notion, that Abrahamic faith lives off of the future, off of the not yet. And so increasingly, I have adopted Wolfhard Pannenberg's theological view, which I'm not a scholar of Pannenberg, but his sense that in some very real way, what we call God is not yet. And that makes sense in a post-Einsteinian universe. After Einstein, we realized that the natural world is not just something statically hanging there in space, but temporality or time is so woven into the very fabric of nature that if time stopped, nature would not exist. So now we have to think of what transcends nature, not just in terms of spatial separation or distance, but in temporal terms, from the perspective of the natural world understood as intricately tied up with time in its very being. Then transcendence has to have something to do with future, with the futurity, with the not yet, as it were, of time. And to me, that way of thinking of God is very fruitful, and it's one that we can take with us in our conversation with the cosmic pessimists and the new atheists and others who complain about the lack of present evidence of the divine. Well, of course not. The not yet simply is not, by definition, present and available to our control. And at the same time, we can allow ourselves to be captured and carried away and surrender to this not yet. And to me, that's the substance of faith. The essence of the life of faith is to open ourselves to this realm of possibilities which have not yet been actualized. And it's also helpful to think that way because when people ask you, what is the nature of the universe? Who are you? How can we explain it? We can't explain anything or understand anything until we see how the story plays out. So we can't be, one of the main themes of my book is that we have to avoid impatience epistemologically and religiously. And both the archaeonomic and the analogical views suffer from what I would call impatience. They want to be swept up into the final perfection of things immediately, or they deny the existence of time altogether by taking the whole cosmos back to the pre-temporal phase of atomic dispersal and plurality. Both of them are attempts to do away with time. Increasingly, that to me is what is wrong with our culture, with our intellectual life, and that's the impatience. And this is why, to me, the Bible is still so relevant in terms of preparing us, putting us in a posture to face the really real, which is coming from up ahead.
Well, when you mention that passage in Pannenberg, where he says there's a true but limited sense in which God does not yet exist, like the not yet existing part has to do with God's decision to be fully invested and related to history in the world and God's creation, right? That possibilities and potentialities are real for God as well as us. And given that the God who gives God's self to the world is for at least for Christians revealed in Christ, then God's identity is not known in its totality apart from the world. And so the openness and the anticipation is a genuine one. And in one sense, you kind of read the Hebrew scriptures, and Yahweh's the God that's ahead of you all the time. That's how it works. Exactly. And yet there are these philosophical assumptions, I think, that led to the Christian tradition to end up missing that. And then there are these philosophical assumptions in modernity that lead to this archaeonomic exploitation of the way we encounter nature. Like, when you think of those kind of philosophical ideas that lead to one, how could you spot them? Because I think they exist in congregations where people have these analogical assumptions or archaeonomic assumptions, and they're keeping us from really seeing the vibrancy that just exists in our tradition.
Yes, and I think there can be an excessively archaeonomic view in our theologies too, which try to make them rest so much on the past, whereas the biblical view is that which is real is still coming. If you survey the early Christian mentality as it's presented in the New Testament, it's so much one that we've lost, and that's the idea that to have a relationship to Christ means not only to tell the story of his historical ministry, but to be open here and now to the real Jesus who is coming from up ahead. That has been lost, I think, by our preaching, by our seminaries, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's such a shame that seminaries don't instruct students according to this new worldview in which the universe is still coming into being, and therefore its identity is something for which we might have to wait. And we have to wait, in a sense, for our own identity, too. It has not yet been shown what we shall be, as St. Paul said. So the theme of a promise is so prominent in Romans and other Pauline literature. And we've lost that. So there's that archaeonomic factor, but there's also the weight of centuries of Christianity's flirtation with a Platonic Hellenistic metaphysics, in which the really real is thought of as being outside of time. And I think that's a posture that even Nicaea tried to get rid of by insisting that God is in time, that the incarnation is real, that Christ is not just the appearance or the seemingness of ultimate reality. But I think the fundamental question that people have is today the same as it's always been, and that's how, given the perishability of our existence, how can we find something indestructible that we can lean on and tie our existence to, and thus alleviate our anxiety and give us courage in the face of non-being, as Paul Tillich calls it. And the traditional way of answering that is to talk about the eternal now, the eternal present, which we can cling to and which we can read transparently through the beauties of nature and so forth. And I'm not at all being too critical of that view. I can certainly understand it. But I think the biblical view, and it is more consonant with the new cosmology, in which the indestructible lies not up above, but somehow up ahead. Mm-hmm. And what gives our lives consistence, as Teilhard called it, and what gives the universe consistence, is that it rests on the future as its sole support. The book I wrote several years back is called Resting on the Future, and it's an attempt to rethink Catholic theology, and by implication, Christian thought in general, in terms of the notion of Teilhard's, which is a very biblical notion, that the world rests on the future as its foundation. That's a hard way for people to think once they've gotten tied up in the archaeonomic and the analogical way of looking at things. And I think our theological education, seminary education, religious education is still predominantly analogical. Well, you might say, well, what's wrong with that? It does give people hope. It gives people a sense that they have a meaning in their lives. And I don't want to deny any of that. But what it ignores is the fact that the value that we attribute to the natural world is partly due to the dramatic process whereby it came about, something we didn't know anything about until starting a couple hundred years ago. Mm-hmm. But our knowledge gaps have been filled in by science. The great gift of science is to show us the narrative, dramatic backdrop of everything that we value, so that the value of life is not simply the fact that it participates vertically in the Platonic good or the heavenly presence of God, but that somehow it's a product of a long drawn-out narrative or drama that the more we know about, the more we appreciate the value of things. Mm-hmm. As Teilhard put it many years ago, if you want to understand a soul, you have to tell the whole story of the universe. And that's something that the analogical view looks upon as not really significant as far as religious and theological education is concerned. Mm-hmm. So this whole cosmic story is a new context. And I think we have to be patient as far as people catching on to it. But for those of us who work with science, who understand a little bit about it, and who know the story of nature more or less, then that's not incidental. That's not something that's simply arbitrary or optional as far as our understanding who we are, what life is, and what the purpose of life is.
Yeah. In one of the things that you do in the book is you're directly engaging a movement in science education around big history. And so for those that haven't read big history books, before this book existed, I taught a class on big history where I basically had to lecture the inside story. But maybe you could introduce us to big history and what you're hoping to do with the text, because I think of like how easy it would be to the non-threatening way introduce science in a religious context if your book's accompanying it, because then the scientific story is given all its due and set in proper relation in the faith context to the inside story.
Yes, and when I was teaching at Georgetown, I used to argue that instead of teaching science sort of architecturally, starting with the math and then building on physics and then biology and so forth in a vertical sort of stack, you're going to draw students into science more if you appeal to the narrative quality of human consciousness, which has been operative since the very beginning of our species' life on this planet. We've always been storytellers, and stories have a way of bringing a kind of coherence, which is another word for intelligibility, that you can't find in the normal way we teach science. We can find mathematical intelligibility or geometrical intelligibility. And this is what Einstein and other scientists were primarily interested in looking for. But there's another kind of intelligibility that humans have always been able to relate to, and that's what I call dramatic coherence or narrative coherence. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of coherence in which, for example, when you read a novel, you start out the first pages, first chapters, you don't know what's going on. You just have fragments. And if you want to understand what those fragments are all about, you have to read on and be patient and not give up, not toss the book away, not walk out of the theater or the film before you see it play itself all the way through. There's a temptation to impatience in all of us. But the notion of narrative requires, by definition, that we have to wait for its meaning. And I think, unfortunately, we've taught theology in a way that has disengaged it from the narrative biblical roots of our theology. And since in science education, telling the story is important for getting narrative coherence, so also in theological education, starting with a story would be a very good way to develop a theological curriculum.
Mm-hmm. And so when most people hear big history, they're probably thinking Gates funded it.
Right.
So what's the normal way of pitching big history, and how do you see this book complementing it?
Well, big history, it's capitalized big in history, originated in history departments,
Mm-hmm.
where some of the historians eventually realized that if they're going to tell the whole story of human history, now in the light of science, of evolutionary science and Big Bang cosmology, we can't just start with the beginning of humanity. We have to go back to the pre-human periods of history if we want to understand human history. And once you start doing that, you have to go back and back. You keep going back and develop a big history, which correlates pretty much with what I'm calling the new cosmic story.
Mm-hmm.
But most of this new movement called Big History, there's now an International Big History Association, is telling us what I call the outside story of the universe, not the inside story.
Mm-hmm.
And it sort of assumes that inside the inside story, or insideness, or withinness, or interiority is something that's mostly human. But we now know, in the light of science, that animals have subjectivity. They have an interior life. And if you go all the way back in life, you find that from the very beginning, there's been something about life that differentiates it from non-life. And that's what Michael Polyani and others have called striving. The way in which we've intuitively, as a species, separated or distinguished living from non-living processes is that we intuitively and empathetically identify the striving that we experience in our own life. For example, you and I are striving for understanding here. Mm-hmm. We project that, or eventually realize that other living species are also striving beings. But striving needs some sort of center. And that's what I call subjectivity. And subjectivity, therefore, is not something that exists only in humans. It also exists in almost any organic form of life. And if you're Alfred North Whitehead, you trace that interiority or that subjectivity all the way back to the very character of the fundamental components of reality, the energy events or occasions of experience, as he calls them, that make up the whole universe. In my own book, I don't deny that you can do that in a Whiteheadian way, but I want to appeal to people who don't have a background in Whitehead's pan-subjectivity or panpsychist way of looking at things. And let us at least recognize that other forms of life are forms of striving. Mm-hmm. But life itself could not have come about unless it was prepared for by all the physical features of the universe, the immensity of space and time that allow for opportunities for atoms to come together into more complex configurations, the fundamental constants, initial conditions that astrophysicists talk about with respect to the Big Bang universe. If you look at them narratively, then the drama of life coincides with the whole cosmic story, as it were. And big history, as at least the way it's understood and carried out in the universities of the world today, for the most part, leaves out that inside story. And so one of the reasons that I wrote the new cosmic story is to show that we need not only a big history in the sense of long, we need a thick big history that recognizes the fact that the universe also has been a subjectivity producing process. Mm-hmm. So that in a sense, that comes back to what I said earlier about mind. We can't really understand what the universe is unless we start with the most intense form of subjectivity that it has brought about. And as far as we know, at least on our planet, that's the human mind. So we can't leave out a kind of phenomenology of mind as necessary empirically to understanding the whole of human history. Mm-hmm. So I like the basic impulse of big history to realize we can't really understand anything until we tell the story about it. But my objection is that they leave out the most important aspect of the story.
Mm-hmm.
And the most intense form of subjectivity, I think, that we know of takes the shape of our religious longing, our longing for meaning, our passionate desire for redemption, for indestructibility, and in that human longing for the indestructible, which has been carried out characteristically in religion, we find, in a sense, what the universe is all about. The universe itself is an awakening. That's how I use it. An awakening to infinity, to infinite truth, meaning, goodness, beauty. And so to understand the universe, we have to start with this intense passion, this intense anticipation, as I call it, that we experience in our own minds. So one of the things I used to have my students do, and I've done this in several books, is to try to turn to the reader and say, look at what's going on in your own mind right now. You're seeking, by reading this book, you're seeking to find understanding. And you're trying to make sense not only of what I'm saying, but of the universe around you. But after you reach that understanding, you're not finished. You want to, if your mind is really anticipating, you want to distinguish bright ideas or partial understanding from true understanding and full understanding. So this longing for fullness in our understanding, not just intellectually, but also aesthetically, our longing for beauty. And this is where Whitehead has been so helpful to me, that somehow he got to the point of recognizing that if we want to understand the universe itself, what it's all about, we have to see it as an aesthetic phenomenon. And so I want to integrate what the medievals used to call the transcendentals, being, unity, truth, goodness, and beauty. I want to integrate them, which are originally analogical ideas, but I want to integrate them into my cosmology and put them not so much as eternal present, but as the goals that are anticipated by us proximately and indirectly by the whole cosmic story. And if you look at the universe that way, it has a meaning to it, a significance to it, a narrative or dramatic coherence to it that science, by definition, cannot reach, because science leaves out considerations of value and meaning and so forth. And I'm not putting down science. I love science, but I just wanted to recognize that it's a self-limiting way of looking at reality. And it's not even as empirical, broadly and radically empirical, as we need to be if we really want to reach right understanding.
Well, I think it's important to get that. The kind of first observation is that if you have a type of radical empiricism, then your empiricism can't just jump to the outside story, because you're the thinking, knowing subject that is thinking.
Yes.
And if you cut off your access point to the external world, then you've already deflated life.
Excellent. That's exactly right. And what you've done is put your finger on what I find wrong with modernity, the intellectual component of modernity in general. I believe that most scientists, including most materialists, especially materialists, don't really believe that their minds are part of the universe. Theoretically, they would say, yes, since there's nothing but material stuff, then what we call mind has to be some version of material stuff. But if they try to justify the trust that they have in their own cognitional powers and abilities, and ironically, the people who are most trustful and confident of their own intellectual powers are usually today people who accept a materialist version of things. But in doing that, they are implicitly swinging back to Plato as far as their location of their own personal minds is concerned. And for forsaking Darwin and science in that moment. But at the same time, metaphysically, they'll say all that exists is just mindless material stuff. And they want to reduce their own minds, since their minds are part of the cosmos, at least metaphysically speaking, to the dust from which they came. But if they do that, if they really believe that, then why would we want to take them seriously?
It is odd. Like the thing I run up against in having those conversations is when someone is ferociously insisting that their subjectivity is a giant fiction, and
yes.
and I can't tell if part of it. So I was talking to a friend the other day who's I don't know if you'd want me to out him, but he's a very noted intellectual who told me after talking, he's like, look, if you keep asking, where does mind come from? How did life emerge? Where values come from, and if they're real, and what in needing an answer to the origin of the universe. If you ask those questions long enough, it might turn out God's a good answer, and I am just against that. That's what, and I don't mean it like, oh, obviously there's no answer where God's not involved. I just mean that there is a certain thing in when you flatten the universe, when you become, my favorite line in your book, cosmological literalist. When it was that if you read the universe in a flattened way, like a fundamentalist reads the Bible, you're taking the life out of it. And that to me sad, not just that, because I know materialists who have robust, beautiful relationships with friends and family, live ethical lives. So I think they're denying it in their life. But I do think we're at a time where even if you don't want to go Trinitarian, there is a vocation for those that can give people the dignity of their life and decisions back. That our best account of the universe needs that inside story, because that's where the beauty and life pulsates.
Yeah, that's very good. Said very well. One of the real ironies that I've noticed since I've been interested not just in science and religion, but in religion and ecology, is that in our culture, those who carry the banner of ecological responsibility most visibly are often people who intellectually are archaeonomists. That is, in the sense they believe that ultimately life is reducible to lifelessness. E.O. Wilson, for example, who I love to read ecologically and so forth, and he could write books on biophilia, the love of life, but yet the fundamental intellectual underpinning of all of his thought is a kind of materialism. And in fact, in his book Consilience, he promotes the idea that the way to integrate all of learning, all of science, all of university life, intellectual life, is to approach things from a purely physicalist point of view, which I find ironic. And years ago, Barry Commoner, who was one of the grandfathers of the ecological movement, used to say, and I think he was right about this, that if we keep thinking that life is reducible to lifelessness, it won't be long until that actually is carried out in practice. And that's really what, in a way, the nature of ecological calamity is, the reduction of life to lifelessness. It's an organic, it's a chemical sort of process. So unless you have a metaphysics that can support our constant intergenerational commitment to the value of life, unless you find a worldview that promotes that, the ecological movement, I think, is headed for disaster. So it's what I'm doing in the book is trying to argue for a worldview that can sustain this love of life from now until indefinitely. But if the archaeonomists are right, then as thought reduces everything to mindlessness, that does not provide a very helpful or enthusiastic incentive for our engaging in the preservation of life. And I want more than just the preservation of life. I want preparation for richer forms of life that could take place as the universe continues the process of becoming, of being born. So this is why, to me, the anticipative approach, it has practical value. It's not an escape from reality. It's a way of facing the really real, which is coming from up ahead. So it's not only a metaphysical change that I'm looking for, it's a deep epistemological change too.
And it's in one of the ways you describe it in the book is because I think a lot of scientific people or secular people or post-religious people who are leaving behind a kind of anti-scientific encounter with religion, they cling to scientific explanations as not an account of something, but or an explanation of something from a particular vantage point. But this account explains the phenomena away, and you give this image of a layered account or a layered explanation. Can you kind of describe what that is? Because it's an affirmation of what science does and a recognition of what it can't do on its own terms.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I developed this in the undergraduate classroom that to try to get students to understand how there can be a plurality of legitimate ways of understanding things. You have to allow epistemologically for explanatory pluralism, for what I call layered explanation. And I've given this example often, and it's kind of hackneyed in a way, but most your listeners probably aren't familiar with it. To understand what layered explanation is, imagine that you have a pot of water boiling on your stove, and someone comes into your kitchen and asks you to explain, why is that water boiling? You could at one level say, it's boiling because the H2O molecules are moving around excitedly and they're making the transition from the liquid state to the gaseous state. And you could spend a whole career, as some physicists do, on phase transitions, which are very, very fascinating phenomena in nature. But you could also have answered the question, why is the water boiling? You could say, well, because my wife turned the gas on. And that's a good answer, too. Or you could also answer by saying, well, it's boiling because I want tea. So there are three, actually, I'm simplifying here. There are many levels of understanding things. But the point I'm trying to make is that you can have different levels of explanation, which are all valid because they don't compete with each other. Mm-hmm. You don't say the water's boiling because of the physical movement of molecules rather than because I want tea. Or you don't say it's boiling because I want tea rather than because of the physical movement. But unfortunately, in the way in which religion and theology are presented and talked about and written about in our culture, especially by people like Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, and Sam Harris, is to assume that there's only one explanatory level. I call it explanatory monism. Mm-hmm. And if there's only one explanatory channel, they will say, okay, it was okay for theology until recently to be the explanation of these things. But now that we have science, let's get theology out of there and put science in as the explanation. So almost all the difficulties in science and religion come down to the conflict between explanatory monism versus explanatory pluralism. Mm-hmm. And what I argue for is the necessity of a plurality of levels of understanding. I testified, as you may know, at the famous trial on intelligent design that took place in Harrisburg, mm-hmm. Regarding the Dover School Board's decision to have the students read books on intelligent design and not just on Darwinian evolution, as though those were competing explanations. And during the trial, I noticed that the way in which the press described what the trial was about also was one of explanatory monism. For example, they would write, the issue in this trial is whether the living diversity around us came about by divine creativity or instead by Darwinian processes. But that's comparable to saying the water's boiling because of I want tea rather than because of molecular motion. No, there can be a plurality of levels. One of the tricks word tricks that the people like Dawkins used is that the Occam's razor tells us that you should take the simplest explanation. If there are a lot of them, since theology's explanation is too complex, let's take science instead, the rule of thumb in science. And it's a good rule of thumb for science itself. If you have a number of competing explanations, it's a good rule of thumb to take the one that makes the fewest assumptions. And that's how science has succeeded. And that's fine as far as science is concerned. But Occam wasn't talking about that. Occam was talking about when you have competing explanations, yes, take the simplest one. But my whole point of explanatory pluralism is that these explanations are not competing with one another. They're not. It's not one rather than the other, and that's how we have to do science and theology. But both on the religious literalist, biblical literalist side, and the cosmic literalist side of intellectual life today, the notion of explanatory pluralism is hardly even mentioned or thought about.
Mm-hmm. So one of the elements in the book is, and recently there's been evolutionary accounts of religion, cognitive science giving accounts of religion, and the heat around for the kind of cultural materialists that if you can just explain religion finally with this outside view, you can get rid of the phenomena, and then we can all grow up and develop Oxford accents.
Thank you for bringing that example up. That's excellent. And that's really one of the main things that got me to writing this book is every week a new book comes out giving you an evolutionary explanation of all the things we do, including our moral and religious lives. And that's become almost academic meme, as it were, across the Western world.
Which do you think, how it functions to me, is evolutionary accounts are theology. They're like the materialist high priest. And they give an account, which then makes it difficult for someone that wants to affirm all the science, but not the metaphysical baggage connected to it.
Yes, and the assumption underlying this is now that we have a physicalist, evolutionary or biological explanation of these phenomena, let's use Occam's razor as they understand it, and just not even consider these more complex supernaturalist or theological explanations. But one of the main points of my book, as you are intimating here, is to point out that I'm not trying to do away with evolutionary explanations, but they exist. Cognitive theories, neurological theories of religion. Let's push those as far as we can. I want to push Darwinian explanations as far as I can too, just as I want to push the physical explanation of phase transitions as far as I can in explaining water boiling in the kettle. So let's push evolutionary explanations of religion and other things as far as we can. We can learn from those, but those do not rule out the possibility that there are deeper things going on in the narrative, in the story itself, that there are meanings that science by definition cannot retrieve. And that's why I want to keep coming back in this whole topic of science and religion to the opportunity we have now to rethink the whole way we do this by acknowledging that the cosmos is a story. We acknowledge also that a story can be read at many different levels of meaning. So, yeah, let's look at it scientifically. Let's read the story scientifically. Let's read it archaeonomically, as long as we don't take that metaphysically. Mm-hmm. And let's read it in all different ways. But let's leave open the possibility that there are other ways of reading the story.
Yeah, so maybe I'd be interested in how you would frame the conversation around the seemingly naturalness of religious belief for humans, right? So evolutionary psychologists will argue that humans naturally believe in supernatural agents or agency without a material location, and a type of dualism, that there is a soul of sorts, and that our minds are structured that way. And now we give an account for why we believe in spiritual agents and the soul. And some give accounts where they're adaptionists, but they're byproducts or spandrels, like where religion is a spandrel of these other mechanisms, and others that's adaptionist in hyper agency detection and or the means by which we survive with group size and stuff like that. How would you frame that conversation, introduce it, and then the other element is how the axial age or this transformation of religion shapes the way you understand the account of religion?
Yeah. Well, I can't do it in detail here, but what I would do is take all these questions and see how they are approached archaeonomically, analogically, and from an anticipative perspective. And I think we can learn something from each of those ways of looking at things. For example, the archaeonomic perspective does fill us in on the narrative sequence of things that had to happen in order for mind, religion, faith, and so forth to come forth. And I want to tell that story, and I appreciate the scientific work that's done. What I object to is the conclusion, the unempirical conclusion after you do that work, that thereby you have fully understood what this phenomenon is. Then I want to appreciate the analogical view. All the centuries of philosophy and theology that sort of molded themselves in terms of the ideal of the eternal present, I think there's something to all of that too. There's an intuitive sense of the value of life and mind and morality and so forth that this has taught us over the centuries. And I want to listen to that too. But there's also this third approach, which I'm saying we need now to think more about, the anticipative approach. And that's the approach which doesn't assume that once we've told the story of the past or listened to the theology of the traditions, that we have fully understood or evaluated properly what life is, what mind is, what faith is, so forth. And I want to do what the book is, in a sense, is a kind of phenomenology of anticipation. Let's look at the fact that the minds that are doing this quest to understand things are anticipating, and this is a necessary condition for science getting off the ground. They themselves are rooted in a kind of anticipative faith, the faith that meaning is worth seeking. That operates in every scientific consciousness, and the faith that truth is worth seeking. Science can't prove, an archaeonomic view cannot legitimate or justify that faith. Mm-hmm. But what can justify that faith is the reality of a future fullness of being that is summoning or inviting the cosmos from the beginning, but in a very intense way when humans come along, toward communion with something indestructible up ahead. And that's where I locate religion in such a way that it in no way conflicts with the work that scientists are doing. What it conflicts with are worldviews which maintain that after you've done the scientific study, archaeology, that you have thereby fully understood the present phenomenon. That is an arbitrary faith statement, which is unjustifiable and which can't even justify the confidence that the researchers themselves have in their own minds as they seek deeper understanding, as they seek truth as distinct from just bright ideas. And so that's just a snapshot of how I want to integrate the three approaches. And I think you can approach almost any question that scientists are researching now, including what is religion, what is morality, in those three ways, and not just in the archaeological way.
In the language you use in the book is rightness, which at first I was struck by, going, well, where's this going? How are you using it? And then it made perfect sense in the way that it actually communicates the best of all three investigatory means. Thank you.
I'm glad you saw that. That's a tough thing. And I use it because it's a term that shows up in religion all the time. In Buddhism, for example, the whole of life, the meaning of life is to seek right understanding, right meditation, right associations, the theme of rightness. And it's there in the ancient Hebrew prophets. Justice is another word for rightness, as it were. And so rightness is a prevalent thing in religion, but it's also an implicit goal in science. Scientists want not just understanding, but right understanding. And ethicians want not just responsibility, but right responsibility. So it's an implicit horizon of all human consciousness. So if a scientist says, how do you know, if a scientist reads my book and says something like, this just does not sound right, well, that scientist has some implicit idea of rightness in order to criticize my book. And so what I want to highlight is this common human attraction, or repulsion too. I mean, we can also turn away from rightness too, and religions can do the same thing too. So in the book, I do emphasize the fact that religions can be very wrong too. But when atheists point out the wrongness of religion, they're doing so only because they too have some horizon of rightness with which they compare it. And that's what I want to focus on, the implicit appeal to the horizon of rightness that every human being has some connection with, whether dim or sharp.
Mm-hmm. So one of the questions that came up to me in reading that is, like when Whitehead talks about religion, he has this dynamism of, his statements about solitariness, that religion's what you do when you're alone, right? In this solitariness. And he tells in Religion in the Making this big story where you move from emotions that then get shared via ritual to then beliefs and stories and narratives that the rituals help interpret the ritual. Then you develop the logic of rationalization that then religions in turn back in on the people, where you want transformation of the material order towards more justice, things. And he says you can see there's this group experience of religion in multiple locations, and what it's doing over time is transforming individuals' consciousness such that it moves past the self to the tribe, to the social, communal, to the universal. And healthy religion, beautiful religion, is one where that horizon of rightness, or the expectation of goodness and justice and beauty, is inclusive of all life. And I wonder how much you're inspired, connected to the Whitehead's way of connecting the individual and the way a tradition and culture shapes it, and the growth and transformation of the shared symbolic structure of a religion.
Yeah, when he talks about religion's what you do with your solitariness, he's not promoting solipsism and so forth, but he's emphasizing that there is an intensification of subjectivity that religion brings about that no other phenomenon can do. But to connect that with what I said about rightness, I've been deeply impressed for many, many years by what I find in Whitehead's books in general, not just Religion in the Making, but he's setting forth a criterion of rightness in terms that very few other thinkers have done, and that's aesthetic terms, that rightness has something to do with beauty. And beauty means the harmony of contrasts, the unification of multiplicity, the integration of nuance. And so you have just nuance and multiplicity and contrast. That's the disorder. That's not beautiful. If you have just harmony and unity without the nuance, that's monotony. And he actually has a whole theory of evil, the evil of monotony and the evil of chaos, that is also a derivative of his aesthetic philosophy that rightness consists of intense beauty, and the more intense the beauty is, the more closely it approximates true rightness. So you can use that as a kind of framework for an ethic, and also for understanding the authenticity of one's religious life. To what extent does your religion integrate the plurality of your experience? And unfortunately, in our theological education, we've left out the experience of scientists themselves. We have to attend to everything. So by leaving out what science is telling us about the universe, we're leaving out an opportunity for bringing contrast into our harmonious monotheistic theological vision. So monotheism does not mean the exaltation of oneness all by itself, but it's oneness because it's built up out of plurality. And I found similar motifs throughout Teilhard de Chardin's writing. For Teilhard, true unity is unity that differentiates. True unity is not homogeneity or uniformity. And this is why he resisted the neo-collectivist movements of the 20th century. I mean, there's something to the socialist idea of bringing everybody into the picture. but it does so at the expense of the personalities of individuals and so forth. So, and that's all a deeply Christian principle. It's a Trinitarian principle. God is not one in spite of being three, but because of being three. So the theme of relationality, which I can't go into now here, but I'm sure you're aware of, it is part of his aesthetic thought too. To be even that solitary religious person is to be in relationship to. So it's not a relationless view of religion, but one that is intensely related. But unity and subjectivity can be intensified by reaching out to plurality, and that's what beauty is. That's what God wants. That's the aim of the universe. The aim of the universe in Whitehead is the intensification of beauty, and the process that leads to that he calls adventure. Adventure is the universe's search for more and more intense versions of ordered novelty or beauty, and that's what he wants to highlight. And good religion, the criterion of healthy religion, is the degree to which it promotes this adventurousness, which has been going on in the cosmos, we now realize, for billions of years. So that you can integrate religion into cosmology through a Whiteheadian prism, as well as Teilhardian.
Yeah. So how does that anticipatory picture of religion change the way you understand your own religious tradition and your own task as a theological interpreter of it?
Well, as a Roman Catholic, I think I have tools here to critique my own tradition. For one thing, I think the crisis in Catholicism that's going on right now, as I see it, and maybe I'll write about this some more in the future, is the crisis about the analogical vision of things. The analogical vision, beautiful though it might be in a pre-processed understanding of the universe, if we carry that forward now as the core principle of Catholicism, I think is already coming to catastrophe. For example, clericalism, which even our Pope has identified rightly as one of the main problems in Catholicism, has fed parasitically on a kind of analogical vision, which organizes the universe hierarchically, with matter at the bottom, then life, then mind, then God. And the closer you are to God, the more priestly you are, as it were. So in a way, I think we have to rethink priesthood. We have to rethink everything now in the light of an anticipatory worldview. And the reason that I can still happily be a Catholic is that this is what the Second Vatican Council, among other things, was trying to do. It was trying to declericalize. It was trying to de-analyze and analogize. It was turning us back to the scriptures. And we have to read the scriptures and the anticipative worldview that you find there, bring that into the center of Catholicism. Unfortunately, that has not happened to the extent that it should have. So the Catholic world is deeply divided right now between progressivists who are more anticipative in their view and who recognize that Catholicism needs to recover the Abrahamic way of the anticipated way of looking at things, and those on the right who, if you analyze everything they say, if you read, for example, First Things magazine, it's a kind of enshrinement of the analogical worldview as the Catholic perspective. But I don't see it as the Catholic perspective at all, especially if Jesus and Abraham and the prophets are taken to be the core of our tradition, as the Second Vatican Council, in several of its documents, tried to highlight. But after Pope John Paul II and others came along, and kind of retrenchment movement set in, and Catholicism has sort of oscillated back toward the analogical worldview. In my book, Resting on the Future, the subtitle has to do with rethinking Catholicism in light of an anticipative worldview. I go through all the features of our faith and try to express what they might mean if we now locate them within an anticipatory worldview rather than the analogical worldview.
So for Protestants who are trying to figure out what's going on when you see your Catholic friends having heated debates around like abortion, environment, life issues, how do you see the insights from science and the rethinking through of metaphysics to impact the social ethics of the church around different questions around life?
Well, what we can learn from science is how the universe has been successful, if you will, in its past itinerary, and just look at how the major leaps that have taken place in the story, the leap to life first, and then the leap to consciousness, and then the leap to communitarian existence have taken place. And there's a fundamental law of recurrence that Teilhard, who was probably the most anticipative Catholic thinker we had in the 20th century, there's a law of recurrence which maintains that at each of those major leaps in evolution, there have been a threefold process. There's first of all, there's a phase of divergence in which you have to have a critical mass of atoms or cells or organisms in order for the next leap or the next phase transition to take place. After divergence reaches a certain critical threshold, then the entities sort of fold back on themselves. Atoms start converging upon themselves into more complex forms of units, like molecules. Molecules become more complex. And then eventually the leap into cellular life takes place that way. So it's a process that begins with divergence, then convergence, and then emergence. So what makes emergence so interesting is that it's always something that brings entities together in an unprecedented sort of way. So what I do is locate Christology at each level of convergence. There's a center around which things converge. The atom has a nucleus. The eukaryotic cell has a nucleus. The organism, the vertebrates have a center, a central nervous system, and so forth. And humans have a centeredness, which is kind of white hot. You have an organism, the human being, which consists of trillions of synaptic connections, all brought together in the capacity to utter the first personal pronoun, I. So it's the theme of true union differentiates, and differentiation doesn't make sense unless it's taken up or abrogated, brought up into a higher sort of unity. So that's the criterion that I want to use in trying to determine what is good, what is valuable. And when we look at human life today on our planet, if you ask me what's wrong, it's the fact that we have diversity. We have whole factions that are willing to stay at the stage of divergence, the kind of nationalism that we see reemerging all over our planet today, that leaves out what we should have learned from the universe, namely that divergence is in support of eventual convergence. At Georgetown University, where I used to teach, there's threshold where you enter into the intercultural center that has engraved on it words of Teilhard de Chardin: "The age of nations is past." and what he means is not that differentiation is past, but it's time for a kind of convergence. So something new will emerge from this process. So that's the basic ethical map that I have in the back of my mind whenever I assess decisions made about politics, especially political life. What should we be doing with our lives as citizens here and now? I have that universe in the background as it's been mediated to me by great thinkers like Whitehead and Teilhard. To what extent is this producing beauty?
Yeah,
this particular action.
Would you say that a lot of the debate then, like around abortion, is an analogical account of the universe colliding with an archaeonomic, and there's a possibility of having a more anticipatory one?
In principle, I think that's exactly right. I'd have to think more about that, and my thoughts are very unformed on all that now, but I think you put it exactly the way I would. that we have an intellectual world which is shaped by archaeonomy, which is willing to accept a metaphysics that reduces life to non-life.
Right.
That is not going to work either. But you have that clashing with the analogical view, which sees the value of a particular person's life as something that was injected supernaturally at conception into this tissue, as it were. And as Teilhard said, that's probably the best we could do in a pre-evolutionary understanding of the world. But now that we have a sense that each life has this whole cosmic history behind it, and also we have the fact that we need to get into our heads and into our spiritualities, that the universe that is unfinished, the universe is still aborning itself, and therefore is not fully actualized. No value is fully actualized yet in the scheme of things. We hope that it will be, but so far we live in an ambiguous world.
Yeah.
The analogical worldview is intolerant of ambiguity. And that, to me, is one of its deepest drawbacks. And what's even worse, it's not really fully apprised of what it is that gives value to things. And I think there's a dramatic value, what Holmes Ralston, my friend Holmes Ralston, calls storied achievement. There's something about a story, having a story that gives a value that an organism would not have if it had no story. I can value you and appreciate you because I know behind that face there's a story, and that story is indispensable to your intrinsic value, as it were. And I just want to apply that to the universe as a whole, that the universe takes on value because it too has a story that builds up, that accumulates, and that I think religiously is ultimately taken in, as Whitehead would say, into the compassionate heart of in the indestructible rightness itself, and thus preserved from absolute death in that way. So I can't conceive of the value of an individual human or of that human's destiny any longer apart from the destiny of the whole universe of which we are a part.
And I think in why I saw the abortion question connected to the environmental one is because I think what the Pope's done recently in statements about the environment is point out it's like I know environmentalists that aren't religious at all who find his language around the inherent value and worth of creation inspirational.
Yes.
I have a good friend that's a lapsed Catholic that went back to church because it was like, this is the most beautiful, clear articulation of our big challenge as a species. And what's in that document is what she told me, was it is an affirmation of creation that science doesn't know how to make.
Yes.
And, you know, I didn't want to be like, you should read John Haught, but I do think that's important. Like that.
I'm glad you brought that up. Laudato Si is, to me, one of the really important religious documents of this early 21st century. And just interestingly, coincidentally, people who read it don't often notice this, but he develops a very almost Whiteheadian aesthetic view of what the universe is all about. The universe, he says explicitly, is about the production of beauty. And at the end of all things, there is beauty, and it's a deeply aesthetic vision. It's a relational vision too. His prayers in the document is, "Let us see that we are related and connected to everything." I've never seen that in any other papal document. It's a new thing in Catholicism, and I've assimilated. I give lectures on Laudato Si and the Pope Francis encyclical quite often. I see that as a good example of the anticipatory vision that I'm trying to get across, and that's another thing that ties me to Catholicism. I really think this is a beautiful encyclical, and one that if we read deeply into it, can motivate intergenerationally the kind of ecological responsibility that we need, and that I don't think an archaeonomic worldview can can undergird in the way that an aesthetic anticipatory vision of the universe can.
Mm-hmm. So I mentioned early, since I read a lot of your books, I had a dream last night that I was hanging out with you. And in the dream, we were at an event called Teilhard for today. And so this is all the people that were there was you, Elizabeth Johnson, Ilya Dilio, Joseph Bracken, and John Haught. And then the other, he wrote Jesus, Symbol of God, Roger Haight.
Roger Haight,
yeah. And you all were talking about Teilhard, and it was pretty exciting. And
incidentally, talking about Teilhard, there is from the right wing, and this comes back to what I was saying about the analogical attractiveness of some Catholics. Recently, there was a young graduate of Notre Dame's theology department, a Catholic, who, although early in his life, had some respect for Teilhard, but he went to Notre Dame, and I don't know what happened there, but he wrote an article trashing Teilhard, accusing him of all these complicity with Nazism, of being opposed to the value of disabled and so forth. And he wrote this column, and some of my friends in the Teilhard Society wrote to me and said, "You've got to do a response to this." Well, I wrote a response some months ago, but only finally has it been published. You might be interested in reading it. It came out in the last issue of Commonweal magazine. Okay. Is sort of a traditionally liberal Catholic publication, and the title of the article is "Trashing Teilhard." And there I try to sort of give a summary of what Teilhard's vision is and how relevant it is, and I use that as a framework for critiquing the trashing that this fellow had unleashed in public media. And right-wing Catholics read something like that and say, "See, we told you, Teilhard is really the enemy of Catholicism." And I know Catholic priests, including some who teach philosophy, who have maintained that by reading Teilhard, they almost lost their faith. Well, what faith was lost? I think it's primarily analogical faith. He does challenge a purely analogical faith, which in a sense needs to be challenged, because analogy inherently devalues and even demolishes time, time itself, as does archaeonomy. So what Teilhard did was help recover for Catholic faith the value of time, the passage of time. And he did it in a way that even Einstein did not. Einstein was still a kind of Spinozist, Platonist at heart. He was more in love with eternity than with time, ironically, even though his equations, field equations, gave us this story of the universe. It's so ironic that he himself made nothing of the value of time. He saw it as a subjective illusion. And the analogical vision does that too, in general, religiously and philosophically. So that to me is the big crisis, the crisis between the analogical attractiveness. It's a very powerful vision, analogy is. It's a mesmerizing, almost intoxicating vision. But what it fails to do is acknowledge the value of the passage of time, which is something the Abrahamic view was able to do. And we need to recover that in a scientific age. And I think the New Cosmic Story gives us a way of doing that.
No, I think the book is spectacular. I love your work. It's always been inspirational to me. So last question I have is, what are 3 books that for someone that's interested in the conversation we're having now, where would you send them after they check out the New Cosmic Story?
Okay, well, I just had a new collection come out. It's called a John Haught Reader, and it's with Whiffenstock. Your mentor, Phil Clayton, I noticed just recently came out with a Philip Clayton Reader as well. I think it's the same publisher. And so you'll find a lot of my past stuff in there. But the book that probably has sold more than others is not really so focused on science and religion, and that's What is God, the book that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
But I've gone, I think, beyond that with the New Cosmic Story. That's what I would recommend to intellectuals anyway. To introductory readers, to initiates, I would recommend my book Science and Faith: A New Introduction. And for Spanish listeners, it just came out in Spanish also. So it's called Science and Faith: A New Introduction. That's what I would start with for others.
In what has been a book or two recently you've read by other authors that have been thought-provoking, inspiring, or maybe it just inspired you to write an article against it?
Well, I follow the writings of the New Atheists because I think they represent to me a kind of fundamentalist reading of Scripture that we can do better than. They're partially familiar with the analogical world-escaping view of faith, but they're completely unfamiliar with what I'm calling the anticipatory worldview. So instead of something, I've read a lot of books recently, but I can't recall any that have so impressed me as much as going back and rereading the works of Teilhard. Mm-hmm. And I would recommend a book called The Heart of Matter. If people want to sort of understand the core of what I'm talking about in this interview, Teilhard's book, it's possibly out of print now, but it's called The Heart of Matter, and I think it's as relevant today as it's ever been. So,
awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to.
Thank you, Tripp, for getting in touch with me.